The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And boy, are we blessed to have Joseph P. Farrell with us. And Dr. Farrell can be found at GizaDeathStar.com. And there is a PayPal button there, and please make use of it so he can keep on with his research, because he has, I think, 3 more books planned.
Oh, yeah, that's true, GeorgeAnn. Thank you for having me back. But yeah, I've got lots of major projects, and I do thank you for that. And I do thank everyone for the donations. They have really truly helped. There's a couple of these book projects right now that the research has been more than the usual in terms of expenses, because there have been some rare books that simply you can't find the information on the internet, and the books themselves, I think in one case, have been kind of suppressed, so it was rather expensive to get a hold of some information. But I do truly and want to thank those people. There's one lady in particular, you know who you are, and thank you so much again. And a gentleman, another gentleman, thank you. So, and thank you for mentioning that.
Yes. Well, Joseph, I think I'm going to dive into the grid of the gods.
Okay. Okay.
And this would be a part 1.
Okay.
Now, there's a very interesting Hermetic axiom.
Yes.
As above, so below.
Right.
What does that actually mean?
Oh boy, that's a really, really good question, and it's a very complex and deep one. I think that if you were to total up all the books that have been written to try and plumb the depths of that one, you'd have books from here to the moon and back again.
Yeah.
Briefly, GeorgeAnn, I think it can be understood on 3 principal levels in increasing importance.
Okay.
The first and most basic level, that axiom is actually a statement made by the figure of Hermes Trismegistus in a bunch of writings called the Hermetica, which I know that you're familiar with. And
yes.
The Hermetica, for those listeners who don't know, they are a collection of writings in Greek and Latin that began to be circulated circa 200 A.D., all right? They claim to be the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, or the Greek name for the Egyptian god of wisdom by the name of Tehuta, all right?
Mm-hmm.
They are a very, very unusual blend of certain Christian elements, of certain kind of Gnostic or Neoplatonic elements from Greek philosophy. But there have always been a number of scholars, a kind of a minority of scholars, that believe that you can find traces of the ancient Egyptian cosmology as well in these writings. And I fall into that camp. I think that underneath, if you peel back the layers of the Christian veneer, then you have a very solid core of Neoplatonic doctrine there. And the reason why that's very important for the answer to this question is that Neoplatonism actually begins in Egypt, all right? It begins with a Greek philosopher by the name of Amanias Sakis, and then his student, who's much more familiar to everybody, by the name of Plotinus, and then Iamblichus and Proclus and Porphyry, all the Neoplatonic writers. They are basically writing for a Greek audience, but they're writing from the tail end of the Egyptian milieu, all right? So in other words, you do have a hard, solid, deep core, in my opinion, within the Hermetica of Egyptian doctrine. So let's go back to your question.
Okay.
As above, so below. That maxim at the most basic level expresses the ancient belief that the astrological and astronomical movements of the heavens, to a certain extent, reflect the mind of God. All right?
Yeah.
And the ancients then, and particularly in Egypt, they laid out their temples and buildings with that kind of thinking in mind. In other words, at one point in the Hermetica, it actually states that Egypt is the image of heaven. It's heaven brought down to earth. And the reason that they say that is, as most modern people now know, is the Egyptian temples and pyramids and so on were all built according to some sort of astrological correspondence.
Yes.
And the reason why that was done, you can read this again clearly in the Hermetica, the reason why that was done was the belief that this somehow, by reproducing a mirror image of the heavens on earth in temples and buildings and their placement on the earth, and that's very important. That's where the origin of the grid idea comes from.
Yes.
But their very placement on the earth somehow captured, and this is a very important point, somehow captured the power of the heavens and literally brought them to earth and embodied them in sacred architecture. So in other words, this brings us to our second level. When you say that it's embodied in sacred architecture, what you're really saying is that architecture for the ancient mind had a principally alchemical purpose. It was to embody the transforming power that the ancients believed that they saw in the heavens.
Yes.
And that power they harnessed in their thinking for two reasons. The first was for, obviously, the good old alchemical practice of transmuting base metal into gold. But what that meant for them was a metaphor of transforming mankind himself. In other words, the phrase that moderns would use would be, to have an elevated or illumined consciousness. All right. So that's the second level at which I think this as above, so below maxim operates. It operates on the plane of consciousness itself. It is meant to bring the human mind, the human intellect, the human will and emotions and everything that we associate with consciousness, to bring it into harmony with what they perceived to be the mind of God, which was visible in the movements of the heavens. Now, the third and deepest level, the one that's most important, is, and again, Grid of the Gods is kind of a book that stands in the line of the books I began with the Giza Death Star series and then on into Cosmic War. So in other words, it's meant deliberately to be tied to that whole arch of books, and even to Babylon's banksters. The third level is that as above, so below to the ancients ultimately means that the physical medium itself, which transforms itself into all the objects of creation by processes of repeated differentiation, that this power, the literal power of creation itself, they are thinking is embodied in these structures. In other words, what they're suggesting, the core of the suggestion, is that these structures are actually machines, and that they are machines to engineer the physical medium itself. Aha. And so now we're square back to the idea, that I began with the Giza Death Star, that the Great Pyramid in particular was a machine deliberately designed to manipulate or engineer the physical medium directly, to act upon it. And therefore, we've said all along in our social engineering series that there's a connection between consciousness and the physical medium. There's a direct interface. Well, if you are making the claim in these buildings to be engineering the physical medium directly, you are also making the claim that you are engineering consciousness directly. So, in other words, what they're really telling you is that they're playing around with some very, very sophisticated physics if, and this is the key word here, if you take their statements in these types of texts seriously.
Yeah.
So the as above, so below, as a final component of this, there is in modern mathematics, there's this whole idea of higher dimensional geometry, of the ability by a mathematical technique to describe objects like the Platonic solids in more than 3 spatial dimensions. And that's where it gets very interesting, because in the book I talk about how the actual mathematical notation of the ancient Babylonians was unusually suggestive of the same notation that modern mathematicians use to describe these higher dimensional objects. And the technique that is used, GeorgeAnn, to do so is counting the edges, the points, and the faces of an object. And it's at that point that, you start counting the edges, faces, and points of Mexican pyramids, and you realize that you might possibly be dealing with analogs of higher dimensional objects. In other words, these things may have been intentionally conceived as machines.
Oh, my.
Oh, my, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Well, oh, my gosh. What about you talk about that there are male and female numbers.
Yes, yes. This is a part of ancient lore that quite literally stretches all the way from India and the Vedic writings all the way into Mesopotamia, and then from Mesopotamia it shows up in the Pythagoreans and even in Plato. And it's directly tied to the ancient understanding of this whole process of differentiation, and it's directly tied to their thinking about music, all right?
Yeah.
And if you remember way, way back in the Cosmic War series, I mentioned that music for the ancients was a cosmological key. It was the first unification in physics, and it was the method by which they understood the cosmos, all right, and all the laws that were operating in them. Well, female numbers are even numbers, like 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. And in musical terms, it doesn't take much study, if you know anything about the harmonic series and music and so on, it doesn't take much study to realize that those even numbers produce the octave, all right? In other words, if you pick any note on the piano, the even numbers will produce octaves of that note.
Yes.
So female numbers in the ancient thinking were the numbers that were the matrix, quite literally, making the play on the word matrix, mother, mater,
Yes.
They were the matrix in which everything came into existence. Now, the interesting thing is, when you get into the Vedas, when you get into, and I do this quite a bit, Grid of the Gods is a very technical book in this sense, that I get into the Vedic music thinking and even more deeply into the Mesopotamian and Platonic thinking about numbers and music, because the male numbers are the odd numbers. They're the numbers that produce differentiation. In other words, you can have all the female numbers you want, but the only thing they're ever going to do is reproduce the same note over and over and over and over. All right? The male numbers produce the different notes in between the octave. So they produce all the different tones. Now, why should they have chosen male and female to describe these things? This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because, again, my presupposition has been always to maintain that these ancient texts and stories and so on are legacies of a very scientifically sophisticated culture. All right? And when they're starting to talk about male and female numbers, it is very odd and interesting that men, the modern male, carries both sexual chromosomes. In other words, the sexual differentiation of the human species does not come from the mother. It comes from the father. All right? A female can only produce, if a female were to somehow reproduce by herself, she would only produce another female.
Yes.
But if a man somehow could reproduce by himself, he could produce either a male or a female. So in other words, for the ancient thinking, you know, this is, I think, based on their understanding at some point that genetics, that the human chromosome, that the sexual differentiation came from the male. And I think this is why they're using this as part of their code in trying to tie all this together. The ancient mind, what really surprises me over and over, and you know, for that matter, I should mention the fact that Grid of the Gods is the first book that I've actually written a portion of with someone else. I had a co-author on certain sections of that book.
Yes.
A friend of mine from Oxford by the name of Scott DeHart. And
is
you know,
he a CIA guy too?
No.
I can't help it.
Yeah, I know. Well, the last I checked, no. He's neither CIA or Illuminatus. No, but you know, this is kind of the conclusion that we came to. We in going through all of these codes and talking about them, you know, this is another one of those books like Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men that really is the product of conversations that he and I have had going back, you know, almost 20 years. What really stands out, GeorgeAnn, and just to me is one of the most amazing things about this, is the remarkable degree to which the ancient mind connected all these dots. Because,
yes.
I mean, my word, look what we have here. We have numerical codes being tied to how musical tones originate, you know, the process of sameness and differentiation, and that's tied to human sexuality and to what can only be, at some point, knowledge coming from a high scientific culture that it's the male of the species that differentiates the species sexually, that transmits the sexual distinctions that we all carry. So, you know, this is, you know, every time I get into this ancient stuff, GeorgeAnn, I'm just continually shocked at the amount of scientific sophistication. And believe me, you know, we're just scratching the surface in terms of what we present in that book. But yeah, this is the explanation for it. The oddness of it musically generates the different notes in a scale. And they are called male because, you know, they're drawing analogies everywhere. This is the key to the ancient frame of mind, is the ability to draw analogies between completely disparate contexts and completely disparate disciplines. And that, in a certain sense, is really a kind of a magical act. It's an interdisciplinary way of thinking that the modern mind is all but lost.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah, it is. It truly is.
They go way out of their way to not teach the young how to think.
Well, it's not only that, GeorgeAnn, but, you know, Scott and I, my co-author, and I have talked about this numerous times, too, as we were working on chapters of this book. He helped me on many of the ending chapters in that book, and one of the things that, you know, and he is involved in professional education, and I was at one point myself, and we are not only shocked at the inability of modern education to teach people how to think, but the other thing that we've noticed is that, unlike the ancient mind, which seems to be able to move between disciplines that are completely different with such ease and such facility, the modern mind, in contrast, seems locked within certain modes of thought unique to each discipline, you know, and perish the idea that you should ever draw connections, say, between linguistics and music, or you know, or literature and mathematics, or you know, things that would seem totally unrelated. The ancient mind did very easily.
Yeah.
And the modern mind, because of the fragmentation of the disciplines and this lame-brained idea that it would be impossible for anyone to know everything about every discipline in order to do that, well, you don't need to know everything about every discipline in order to draw connections between them. And in fact, if you look at the way the ancient mind works, you know, kind of the way we laid it out in Grid of the Gods, if you look at the way the ancient mind works, the reason that it did work that way, and the way that human intelligence in general works, is precisely analogically. You move from a familiar context to an unfamiliar one by drawing analogies between them. I mean, that's just the way the human mind works. So, you know, the better you get at interdisciplinary thinking, the easier it becomes. And, you know, this I think is the other key behind this business of male and female numbers and how they're tied into music, and the reason that that's there and that they're able to do this is that they have brought analogical thinking to a very, very fine degree of development and to a very extraordinary degree of subtlety. And it's always amazing to me to watch this in action, the details that they cast such a wide net, and they bring so many details into this vast cosmic construction. Now, here's the problem, GeorgeAnn.
Okay.
Here's the problem. It's very easy for the modern mind to look at all of this stuff and dismiss it as fanciful until you get to the point when you're examining some of these structures on the global grid that are 15 to 17,000 years old, all right? And you find in them embedded dimensional analogs of the numbers of quantum mechanics, which isn't rediscovered, and I use that word advisedly, which isn't rediscovered until the early 20th century. And just to show you the importance of those numbers, those are the things that make the computer on our desks work. Those are the things that make the electron guns in our television sets work. So in other words, all of this modern technology, all of this amazing stuff that we are thinking of now, the numbers of the physics behind it are embedded in structures of a supposedly unscientific Neolithic culture building some of these sites on the grid.
Wow.
So the only conclusion, GeorgeAnn, I can come to is that whoever's building these things is doing so on the basis of a scientific legacy from a very high culture that has been handed down to them. And therefore, if they're building these things and talking about male and female numbers and, you know, differentiation and music theory, we'd better sit up and pay very close attention. Because if we throw it all out as just ancient nonsense and wishful thinking and sympathetic magic and all of that, if we throw it all out, we could very conceivably be throwing out some very important scientific clues. That's the problem with all of this.
Let's reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. Let's go through this again, you know, and try and figure it all out. Exactly.
Well, there was I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Nabta Playa?
Nabta Playa, yes, in Egypt. Well, that's the site I'm talking about that embodies some of these numbers of quantum mechanics. It was a site that was discovered in the 1970s. And GeorgeAnn, you know, you've really got to read the book to believe the detail. That it's just
stunning.
It's stunning. Yes, it's mind-boggling that they would have planned this site, because for one thing, you're looking at a site that was planned in 3 dimensions, at least. So that, you're not only looking at a site with surface features, but a site that had deliberately designed underground features at 2 levels underneath it.
Joseph, isn't the site itself older than the sediment that it's built on?
Yeah, it is.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's older than that, and the alignments in it are to, number one, the galactic center, which is, you have to mathematically compute that.
Yeah.
And then there are analogs of the Sagittarius dwarf galaxy. Most people are unaware that our galaxy, the Milky Way, has a kind of a satellite galaxy right outside of it, which is a dwarf galaxy called the Sagittarius galaxy. Well, there's elements within the structure that strongly indicate that whoever built this place knew of that.
Yeah.
And in addition to all of that, this whole structure, this compound, is built with 3 different logarithmic scales all at once, and it also encodes some of the numbers of quantum mechanics. So in other words, what we're saying here, folks, is that this wasn't built by a medicine man with a bone stuck through his nose.
That's right.
This is a sophisticated structure that's coming out of some real deep and very high scientific awareness, and that's the problem. And the other part of the problem is that this structure is probably somewhere between 15,000 and 17,000 years old.
Yeah, I just about lost it when I read the age of it, and then it said that it's older than the sediment that it's built on.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's the whole thing, GeorgeAnn. I mean, if and I have to make a confession here. We barely touched, really, the world grid. I mean, if you were to write a book, an encyclopedic work on the world grid, it would last several volumes.
Yes.
What we did is we concentrated on certain areas that are the most unique. In other words, the pyramids in Mesoamerica and some of the structures in South America, obviously Egypt. The centers of pyramid building. But I also point out some modern anomalies. I point out the fact that the Nazis were busily building things on grid sites.
Yes.
So the whole thing is just very perplexing. What I think was unique about what we did in this book is that we weren't trying to concentrate solely and exclusively on numbers and on all the buildings all over the world that are built on the grid. We were also trying to point out the fact that some of these structures could only have been machined. In other words, it required a technology equal, if not more advanced than our own, even to build them.
Yes.
And also, we were trying to point out that you cannot understand these sites if you simply look at the mathematics and the numbers. You also have to look at the legends and lore and texts of the people that are associated with these sites to see what they say about them.
Yes. Well, Joseph, do the sites themselves have any manipulative power over the medium?
Oh yes, that's the point of the book. I think they do. I spent a lot of time setting up the pyramids in Mesoamerica. Mm-hmm. That you don't really get the mystery of why I think they are machines of some sort until the very end of the book. Because if you look at those pyramids in Mesoamerica, they're not true pyramids. In other words, a true pyramid are the smooth-sided things like you find in Egypt.
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
The ones in Mesoamerica, and for that matter, the pyramids in India, with all of their crenellated corners and faces and ornamentation, I think these are analogs of higher dimensional objects.
Oh.
And the reason why is, again, in higher dimensional geometry, the basic technique used by geometers to describe objects in more than 3 dimensions is to count the corners, the edges, and the faces.
Oh.
That's exactly how it's done. That's the basis. I can't get any more blunt than that. That is exactly the technique that is used mathematically to describe these things. So I think the people building them, they are clearly placing these sites at a location based upon a prime meridian running through Giza.
Yeah.
This is very clear. And if you look at the sites in Mesoamerica, they are more or less almost exactly 120 degrees west of Giza. All right?
Mm-hmm.
So their very placement is with respect to Giza. So in other words, the other way of looking at the grid, GeorgeAnn, is not only are these machines that are somehow manipulating the physical medium, all right? The other way to look at the grid is that by building on sites all over the world, by building on sites that have certain mathematical relationships to other sites all over the world, what you're looking at is somebody was turning the entire planet into a huge machine.
Oh
yeah.
Oh.
Now the question is, why?
Yeah.
Why are they doing this?
Why?
Now I don't get into any speculation about that in the book.
Oh.
The reason why is my co-author and I are we plan eventually to do this, but to answer that question we have to do other books in between this book. The answer to the question. I go back to the way that these books have been set up, because you can't just plunge into these questions willy-nilly. You have to put them in the right context, and it's trying to check yourself against the ancient mind is very difficult.
Yes.
It's the old computer programmer's problem. You can ask the right questions, but if you ask them in the wrong order, you're going to get the wrong answer.
Yes.
so that's the problem here. I can speculate on why I think they're doing this. I think, in part, it's related to my hypothesis that the Great Pyramid is probably the oldest of all these structures.
Okay. The one at Giza?
The one at Giza.
Okay.
And that it was deliberately built and used in a war as a weapon.
Yes.
All right? I think most of the other pyramidal structures around the world were built as machines, possibly, and this is a huge speculation here. I'm not only crawling out on the limb, I'm crawling way out to the end, little tiny twig at the end of the limb.
Yes.
So this is a huge, exactly. This is a huge speculation. But I think the rest of these sites were built in part as a machine that would somehow stabilize and protect the planet after the use of that weapon in that war and the instability that it caused in the mechanics of the solar system.
Yes.
That's exactly what I think is going on here. And I think that they were possibly, and again, this is another huge, whopping speculation without a shred of evidence whatsoever, okay? But speculating again, I think that they were built as not only as things to kind of stabilize and protect the planet, but that they were built possibly with a view to be activated
at a later time.
At a later time in certain geometric configurations of local space-time. Follow me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, Joseph.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh. Well, look at what's going on in the Middle East.
Yes, exactly.
The people are just desperate.
Well,
to be free.
I think, we may be in part. I certainly don't deny that you have a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering and manipulation by various elites, vying for and struggling for control and trying to set up their apocalypse theater scenarios and, all the nonsense that power elites have been up to for centuries, all right?
Yeah.
I don't have any doubt about that. But I don't have, by the same token, any doubt that much of this is also spontaneous, that, people just had it.
Yeah.
And this is increasingly true all over the world. Well, something, I think, is acting to activate this sudden transformation of consciousness, and I don't think it's entirely the manipulation of these elites.
No, it can't be.
No, it's the physics. It's it's the mechanics of what's going on, and again, crawling way out on the end of the twig here. It may be the case that some of these things are turning on. People are tuning in, I don't know. But all of this is wild speculation, obviously, and that's the reason why I don't answer all these questions in Grid of the Gods. I'm trying to set up the groundwork to be able to answer the questions.
Well, it's interesting that Zawi Hawass, he cordoned off
Giza, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I always thought that was very strange and suspicious. I can understand the rationale of the Egyptian government at the time of doing that to protect the site from vandalism, terrorism, and so on and so forth. But part of that never made sense to me, GeorgeAnn. I mean, a terrorist, with a couple 100 pounds of C4 strapped onto him isn't going to do any damage whatsoever to the Great Pyramid or some of those monuments there. I mean, they've been there for millennia, and they've withstood earthquakes that would make any, little explosion that a terrorist could cause, nothing.
Yeah.
So that, to me, was kind of a suspicious cover story. I think that what we've been looking at, GeorgeAnn, with respect to, well, let's answer the question this way. Let's approach it from a very historical point of view. The 19th century saw the rise of researchers, and even before that, but really in the 19th century, you saw the real first rise of people in Europe, largely in Great Britain, France, and Germany, that realized that their whole landscape was laid out on this huge grid.
Yes.
And they started to study it and explore it, of course, and out of all of this research and scholarship came the whole system, the whole idea that there was a grid, ley lines and all of that stuff. The first people that appear in modern times to have looked at this and understood that there was some sort of power being tapped into here were, guess who? The Nazis.
Yeah.
Because as I point out in the book, even Hitler's East Prussia headquarters was built on a center of two of these lines on the grid.
Oh my.
Oh my. Yeah, exactly. They built some of their powerful long-range, low-frequency radio transmitters on these points. All right? Oh ho ho. So they understood something.
Yes.
And I think that this is the beginning of the attempt of modern, technologically sophisticated powers to control these sites. I think that this, and I've always thought this, GeorgeAnn, and you'll recall that we talked about this way back in the Cosmic War series.
Yeah.
I've always thought that was at least one of the hidden agendas for the American and British presence in Iraq. And incidentally, a presence that kicked out the French and German presence there.
Yeah.
So So there's that. Now we have this activity in Egypt, and the stunning announcements of hieroglyphs being found in chambers that they've opened up with a robot.
Yeah.
There's all this noise about going into Iran, which again has its own ancient sites, its own libraries, and so on and so forth. And Libya, of course, which again has its own sources and so on. And I'm not discounting the other explanations as to why all this is happening in these countries, but I think this also is an aspect of it. I think somebody realizes that these sites, that these places have some sort of key to unlocking human history and to unlocking some potentially very dangerous power.
Yes. Oh. And we know what they'd be after, the power. Oh,
yes, exactly. Exactly.
Oh, Joseph.
Yeah.
What are galaxy gates?
Galaxy gates?
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand the reference. There are certain times, my guess is, I haven't heard the term before, so I'm going to guess here on what you might be drawing from. There are, as you know, in astronomy and in astrology, there are recurring patterns that you can predict and plot.
Yes.
Now, if you were to take the normal astrological idea, which deals with only the planets in the solar system, and extend it to a galactic level,
okay,
you would have recurring patterns of alignments with the sun and the planet and the galactic center. All right? And there is a body of thought, there is a school of thought out there that says that this is the real meaning behind 2012, because there's going to be an unusual alignment that only occurs once every, few thousand years or so, or million years or so, or whatever it may be, that the sun and certain planets in the solar system are aligned with the galactic center, and that will, so to speak, hook up some sort of cosmic current. In other words, it's back to physics again.
Yeah.
And that may or may not be true, GeorgeAnn. I don't know. I haven't researched that phenomenon well enough to know. I know there's a lot of people out there that do that. I just haven't jumped on the 2012 bandwagon, although certainly by the nature of the case I wouldn't discount it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my speculation in answer to that. It may be also that in those alignments some sort of, again, drawing on our analogy of higher dimensional physics here, that in those alignments a door or gate is opened like a sluice gate on a dam.
Well, could that be why they plan so fastidiously the shuttle shots, like going to the moon or sending one off to Venus or wherever?
It could be, yes. I mean, it could very well be. Richard Hoagland has for years, going back to about the mid-1990s, has been saying for years that in his investigations, many space missions are launched either on a ritually significant day,
yes,
or they land at their designated target on a ritually significant day, or both.
Oh.
So in other words, it appears that somebody, at least within the American program, was using the space program as a huge ritual of celestial magic, to put it very bluntly.
That's a mouthful, Joseph.
Yes, it is. I realize that, and I'm not the one saying it. Richard Hoagland is.
Gosh. Ritual celestial magic. Oh.
Yeah, and again, you have to think in terms of the ancient mind and how it thought symbolically. You're sending up a bunch of rockets into deep space. Well, you have a phallic symbol essentially penetrating the matrix of empty space, of the void, and again, that's exactly the way the ancients would have viewed it. And so to do something like that, they would have said, well, you've got to do it on certain times and dates in order for the magic to be good, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, and to be quite honest, I've looked at some of these dates and alignments and so on myself, and I'm always amazed that they seem to be there. You know, the classic case in point to me is you have the Apollo 11 moon landing taking place on July 20th, 1969, which is exactly 25 years on the anniversary of the day of the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. And, you know, at that time in NASA, the Nazis are the ones with the most influence.
Yes.
So, you know, to land a mission on a particular day is, you know, that takes months of pre-planning. You don't just do this.
Right.
And the more you see these types of coincidences and alignments stacking up, the less they're coincidental. It means that they have been deliberately planned to be this way.
Yes.
So yeah, vast rituals of celestial magic.
Boy, do we know what's on the dark side of the moon?
Yes, we do.
What's on the dark side of the moon?
Well, if you look at, there are a number of, and you know, you ask that question, and I'm gonna toss something out there. I'm not going to comment about it. But let's say the Earth grid system isn't confined to Earth.
Okay.
Let's say it's a real celestial grid.
Okay.
Is it possible that you could find grid patterns on other planets? Well, in fact, if you look at the body of research that, again, Hoagland and some other people did in the early years of investigating the face on Mars, they were able to come up with a kind of a primitive grid system on Mars. And there are certain things on the moon that also look the famous Blair cuspids on the moon are laid out in a very regular geometric pattern. So you're looking at kind of the remains of some sort of grid. But if you go to the dark side, there were pictures taken. The dark side really isn't dark. I mean, you know, it depends on when you go there. It's in the light sometimes, and it isn't at other times. It's just that we never see that side when it's in the light. But they've photographed and mapped the dark side of the moon. The dark side of the moon is, for the most part, pockmarked much more heavily than the side that we see by craters, as you would expect. But there are some things on the dark side. My publisher, Adventures Unlimited Press, has a book by David Childress that's called Extraterrestrial Archaeology. And he's published a number of very interesting pictures in that book of the dark side of the moon. And you really have to sit and study them slowly and carefully and with a magnifying glass. But they're mostly pictures from the Apollo missions and space probes to the moon. And again, if you study them slowly and carefully, you'll notice some odd things.
Do you think that the moon is an artificial thing? That it was constructed?
That the whole moon was constructed? Well, let me put it this way. I think that you can make the case. In fact, there has been a couple of British authors, I forget their names, I think it may have even been Christopher Knight and Alan Butler, wrote a book called Who Built the Moon? And that is based in turn on some articles that actually appeared in Soviet science back in the days of the Soviet Union, that there were Russian scientists seriously proposing that the moon was an artificial object. So again, you know, the Russians have been thinking outside of the box for a much longer period of time than people in the West. And you know, it's treated respectably to get published in journals like that. But I will say that the moon in terms of the physics of its orbit around the Earth, that none of the standard models to explain why it's there, doing what it's doing, makes any sense to me. Because for one thing, if you look at the size of our moon compared to its parent planet, the Earth, our moon is much larger than the moons of the other planets. In fact, our moon, in terms of its size in relationship to the Earth, is gigantic. Okay?
Oh my.
The moons of Mars are just these little, relatively tiny affairs in terms of their relative size to the planet, and certainly the moons of the gas giants even more so. So when you look at the size of our moon that's orbiting planet Earth, it is enormous. Now, the standard model of how the moon got there in physics textbooks that you read in school nowadays is that the moon was kind of wandering through the solar system and it got captured in orbit around the Earth, all right? Well, there's a whopping big problem with this.
Yeah.
Because if you can imagine any celestial body entering the gravitational field of the Earth, what that does is, as it enters the gravitational field of the Earth, it will speed up, all right? And then it will swing by the Earth, and then it'll start to slow down, right?
Yeah.
That means that the orbit that it will assume around the Earth is going to be a huge elliptical orbit. And it'll zoom in towards the Earth, it'll get larger, and it'll zoom in faster, and then it'll speed away from the Earth, it'll slow down, and it'll get smaller. Do we see that? No. What we see in the moon is an orbit around the Earth that is nearly perfectly circular. And it's also positioned in orbit around the Earth at exactly the right distance to cause a total eclipse of the sun so that the corona of the sun is visible, but the sun isn't. So in other words, it has to be perfectly positioned to do that.
And it's tied to the tides.
And it's tied to the tides.
And to a woman's menstrual cycle.
And to a woman's menstrual cycle. Yes. And on top of all of that, the moon, just like the Earth, is rotating around its own axis, right?
Yes.
But it's rotating and orbiting the Earth in such a way that it doesn't look like it's rotating. Because we only see 60% of the surface of the moon, and it's the same 60% of the surface that we see all the time.
Yes.
So in other words, to cause all of this to happen, GeorgeAnn, simply by the capture model is nuts.
Yes, it is.
So in other words, for it to be in that kind of orbit, what I'm saying is it had to be parked there.
Yeah.
Okay? Someone drove it and parked it. Okay?
This may sound funny to some people, but the Mormons, I don't know if it was Hugh Nibley or one of their writers wrote about that the moon was brought there and parked.
Parked, yes. Well, back in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, I mentioned a Hindu legend that the old moon broke. And then there are legends from ancient Greece of a time when there was no moon. Okay? So in other words, human memory has present in it, in some of its very ancient legends, has a memory of a time when there was some sort of cataclysm and, there was an old moon and it broke.
Yeah. And
then there's a Greek legend of a time when there wasn't any moon at all.
My goodness.
So, in other words, the physics of it, people ask me all the time, GeorgeAnn, have you ever seen a UFO? And as a matter of fact, I have, but my normal response is to people that ask me that question, well, every time there's a full moon.
Yes.
I mean, you want a UFO that's doing all sorts of strange things. There it is, folks.
Oh, my goodness.
It's got all sorts of strange things on it, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it does. Why do we find trinities all over this planet?
You mean, like Father, Son, Holy Spirit?
Well, 1, 2, 3.
Vishnu, Krishna, and Shiva.
Yeah.
Okay. GeorgeAnn, that is one of the central questions, and in fact, I've been answering that question since the Giza Death Star destroyed, and am writing about this whole question again. The first thing that people have to get out of their mind is that the idea of a Trinity is not exclusively nor even uniquely Christian.
Right.
In fact, there is nothing specifically revelationally based about the idea of a primordial Trinity.
Yes.
What I get at in Grid of the Gods, and I've mentioned this before in other books, is that the ancients appear to be preserving a topological metaphor. In other words, an explicitly higher dimensional mathematical metaphor.
Yes.
Now, the way to explain why we have trinities all over the world, whether we're calling them Vishnu, Krishna, and Shiva, or Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or if you follow the Neoplatonists, one intellect and world soul, or if you're the Egyptians, Ptah, Nefertum, and Nefertiti, whatever names you want to give.
Yes.
The point is that you're dealing with a basic structure that emerges in the ancient mind and in this mathematical metaphor.
Uh-huh.
If you can imagine an infinitely extended sea of absolute nothing in every direction, having absolutely no distinctions within it, all right?
Oh.
If you can imagine that, what you're imagining is the undifferentiated physical medium, or if you want to call it consciousness, you can call it that. If you want to call it the absolute, you can call it that. If you want to call it God, you can call it that. Whatever you want to call it, you can call it.
Yes.
But you're dealing essentially with something that is utterly outside of the ability of any metaphysical system to capture. This is why they're using names to describe essentially a mathematical metaphor, all right? Oh. Now, in a supreme act of imagination, imagine that this field of nothing
yes.
is split into two.
Okay.
All right? By whatever process, you don't need to know what does it, you just assume that it happens.
Yes.
All right? Now, when you do that, you are creating what topologists would call two regions. You've still got nothing, but you've got two regions of nothing.
Okay.
And they touch upon, here's the whopper, they touch upon a common surface between the two of them, which is a third nothing.
Oh.
So the moment, in other words, the moment that you imagine that you have distinguished any region of nothing, you've created a 1-3. You've created a trinity.
Oh, my goodness.
And I spent a lot of time in the chapters of Grid of the Gods that I wrote. I spent a lot of time laying out how this metaphor is repeated over and over and over, regardless of where you look.
Yeah.
In the Vedas, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica with the Mayan Popol Vuh, over and over and over you get the same thing. The important thing to remember is that this is a metaphor. It's a legacy of a very high civilization that is using the language of religion and philosophical metaphysics to describe essentially what is a mathematical process in topology.
Oh my goodness, Joseph.
Once you've been able to see that
or grasp it,
yes, then the names of all of these systems of religion fall off.
Yeah.
And you are able to grasp how the ancient mind worked through all of these analogies between different disciplines, because in their thinking, which again is very, very peculiarly modern.
Yes.
In their thinking, everything that arises out of a process of continued differentiations of nothing. So you're also describing a mathematical metaphor that is, in a certain sense, describing creation out of nothing.
Yes.
Ex nihilo.
Yeah.
Because in physics terms, a nothing is simply something that cannot be observed. And in physics terms, the only way that you can observe something is if there are distinctions.
Yes.
So if you have an undifferentiated nothing, you have a nothing. And if you have a differentiated something, you've still got nothing, but now it's beginning to acquire the properties of something. Okay? I know that sounds kind of kooky, but that's the way it works.
Oh, my goodness. Well, hieroglyphs.
Uh-huh.
And the analogical nature of the physical medium.
Yes.
What does that mean?
All right, I've just described it, because in that process of that original differentiation, you've still got three differentiated nothings. You've got the two regions and their common surface, all right?
Uh-huh.
So you've got differentiated nothings. So each of these things, each of these entities has something in common between the three of them, and that something that they all have in common is the original nothing from which they come.
Oh.
Follow me?
Yes.
Now, in the Egyptian thinking, this is a real mind blower for folks. But in mathematics, you can actually symbolize that nothing by a formal symbol that is used to describe the empty hyperset. All right, it's a set with absolutely no members.
Okay.
There's nothing in it. Okay.
Okay.
But now the odd thing is that within that kind of mathematics, functions can be members of the empty set.
Oh.
Because functions or processes are not things.
Yes.
So in other words, they're present in, and again, you can find this in the Vedas, you can find it in the Neoplatonists, you can find it in the Hermeticists, you can find it it wherever you want to look. They will tell you that this nothing is also the all, or the absolute, that contains all things in potency.
Uh-huh.
Okay? Now, the interesting thing is you can represent that mathematically.
Oh.
And the way to do so is by functions. So what does all of this have to do with Egyptian hieroglyphs, you might ask? It has a great deal to do with Egyptian hieroglyphs, because if you look at the hieroglyphs very carefully and really think about them, I mean, you can't just stroll by and notice what odd, strange things that they depict. You have to really think. What they're depicting are functions.
Oh.
They're depicting gestures.
Yes.
You see? And when you start talking about functions, then you start mapping, okay, I've got these functions here. Oh, and looky there, I see them over there in that hieroglyph, but over there, they're coming with a few other different functions.
Yes.
So in other words, when you cross from one context into another, what you're doing is you're recognizing common functions or forms from one context to another. That's analogical thinking right there. That's exactly what analogies do. They recognize a common set of forms or functions from one context to another.
Okay.
That's exactly how it works, and that's analogical, and that's, in a certain sense, that is a form of magic.
Yes. Yes, it is. Joseph, how is it that they came up with blood sacrifice as payment for debt?
Oh, boy.
I mean, that is so ghoulish, so gruesome.
GeorgeAnn, yeah. That is a question that my co-author and I we have discussed it for
20 years.
For 20 years we've discussed this. Because in the Grid of the Gods, one of the things that we do is we point out that the logic, the reasoning behind the Christian theological doctrine of the sacrifice of Christ,
yes,
and the Aztecs' reasoning or justifications for actual human sacrifice is one and the same.
Oh.
Yeah. Now,
well, the throwing of the virgin into the volcano.
Yes,
yeah.
all of these gruesome, grisly practices.
Mm-hmm.
We are in the process, GeorgeAnn, of writing a book now.
Yes.
Where we are going to address that question, hopefully, in more detail.
Oh.
So I don't want to answer too much of it now, because the answer, there have been lots of people who've made a stab at the answer, and I'm not certain that our stab at it will be any more satisfactory than anybody else's stab at it. But to get an appreciation of where the answer might lie, let's go back to what I wrote in Babylon's Banksters.
Mm-hmm.
That you have essentially two systems of finance.
Yes.
You have two systems of physics.
Yeah.
All right? And you have two different elites or priesthoods promoting each one.
Yeah.
One is a closed system of physics. In other words, you never get out of the system as much energy as you put into it.
Right.
You have a closed system of finance where you never put into circulation enough money to pay the interest on principal that banks loan into circulation.
Yes. So
in other words, you've got an endlessly dwindling return. You've got a closed system that's based ultimately on debt, mm-hmm. and a closed system that's based ultimately on a closed system of physics which cannot gate energy from higher dimensions, okay?
Yeah.
So in that system, what kind of gods do you have? You have debt gods.
Yes.
And you have the idea, just like principal, the interest on principal of a debt, of a national debt, can only grow, and so you're in perpetual servitude. The same logic is applied to these debt gods. Now, interestingly enough, you have systems that follow religiously the other idea, namely, the very earliest sort of Vedic thinking.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me, GeorgeAnn, that in the development of Hinduism, mm-hmm. you had an initial stage where there was this kind of open corn god free energy system, all right?
Yes.
At a later point, you see human sacrifice and bloody sacrifices being introduced in Hinduism. And then at a still later point, you see them turning away from it. I think the reason why this whole abysmal way of thinking got started is intimately related to the problem of corn god versus debt god, or to put it in more modern terms, of open system physics and closed system physics, and open system finance and closed system finance. And let us remember one very important thing. The closed system of finance back in ancient times was intimately related to religion.
Yes.
So these three things, to answer the question, GeorgeAnn, requires a very, very careful unpacking of the relationship between certain cultures' idea of God or the gods,
yeah.
their idea of how in other words, their physics of how the cosmos came to be and why it is the way it is, and the system of finance or money that they use. Yes. These are all intimately related.
Oh my.
Intimately related.
Oh.
Yeah, ho, 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 ho.
Oh.
Is it any wonder, ask yourself this, that the major banking houses and families do not promote or grant big donations to religions like Buddhism or Hinduism, with but a few significant exceptions?
Yes.
Yet at the same time, they are themselves heavily involved with promoting the concepts of those religions.
Yes.
You follow?
Yes.
That's another interesting thing, because you find them on both sides of the activity there. So even to answer the question, GeorgeAnn, is going to answer it satisfactorily and in the detail that it requires is going to take a few more books to set up the context to be able to answer it. The other thing, though, I would point out is that in Grid of the Gods, we pointed out that the Aztecs, if you read what they say about the origins of human sacrifice within their culture, they come right out and tell you that their original civilizing god, Quetzalcoatl, absolutely prohibited that kind of sacrifice and refused to engage in it. Okay?
Yes.
He was overthrown by a group of priests that are called sorcerers.
Yeah.
And the guy that was sort of their leader, here's a whopper for you, was a fellow by the name of Yaotl.
Oh.
Does that name sound a little familiar?
Yes, it does.
Yes, it does. And that they drove Quetzalcoatl out of the city and basically took it over and instituted the new order.
Oh.
So in other words, this is very interesting to me, GeorgeAnn, because you have the same pattern in Hinduism.
Yeah.
You have an original primordial state. At a later period, you have the institution of sacrifice. The Aztecs never get rid of it. The Hindus are successful. And largely, I think that was kind of an effect of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, that did that. But, you've got all of this stuff. It's just amazing to me.
Well, Anselm. Yeah, he said something to the effect that it is a payment for the honor of God taken by man.
Yes, yeah.
What the heck does that mean?
Well, you're referring to Anselm of Canterbury, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who wrote a famous treatise that my co-author and I cite in the book. The treatise is called Cur Deus Homo in the Latin, or in English, Why the God-Man. Mm-hmm. All right. At the beginning of this treatise, Anselm says something very significant and very profound, and I hope people will really listen here. Okay? And I'm paraphrasing my quotation. He says, at the very beginning, in fine, leaving Christ altogether out of view, as if nothing had ever been known of him, we shall prove by absolute reasons why God had to become man. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now listen very carefully to the logic that he just set up.
Okay.
He set up absolute reasons above God and above Christ. So when you get into the treatise to find out what are these absolute reasons, you discover that basically the logic is this. When man sinned, he sinned against an infinite God, and therefore owed God an infinite debt.
Okay.
So the first thing you got to ask yourself is, number one, does that logic follow? Then the next thing you've got to ask yourself is, okay, why would God require an infinite sacrifice to make himself happy again?
Oh, gee.
Is that moral?
Yeah.
All right? Anselm goes on to say, okay, mankind owed an infinite debt to God. But mankind, being finite, can't pay an infinite debt, right?
Right.
But only man was responsible for paying it. Only man could, quote, satisfy the debt. Now, when you hear that word satisfy, what you should do is think like a bankster. What he's saying is, it would require an infinite sacrifice, but by man himself, to zero balance the books. That's what it means. So in other words, the bottom line is that Christ, God, the Son of God in the Christian doctrine, becomes man in order to pay as man the infinite debt which only he, as God, could pay.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. So in other words, the bottom line is you've just turned God into a bankster.
Yes. Yes. Oh.
There it is. Once again, you've got the same logic in religion and sacrifice as you have in the finance of money as debt. And in that system, regardless if you're looking at the medieval Latin church or if you are looking at the Aztecs, in these systems, what does this make man?
Yeah.
Property.
Yes.
Slaves.
Yes. Absolutely. Oh. My gosh, Joseph.
Yeah, it's big.
It's huge.
Big.
It's huge.
It's huge. Absolutely.
Oh, my goodness. That is a stunning.
It's a whopper.
Answer. It really is. Oh my gosh.
It's a whopper.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a whopper.
Oh.
Now, if you go to the earliest Vedic literature of India,
yeah,
what is described there is something very unique. Sacrifice is the word that is used of God's original creation of all the diversity of the world. And I will leave it for people to try and figure out why is that word used to describe creation rather than a debt creation owes to God. Once you've figured that out, I think you're well on the way to resolving the problem of why sacrifice in the proper sense arises. Because in my opinion, GeorgeAnn, when it does arise, when bloody sacrifice does arise, it is a vast, massive perversion and twisting of a metaphor that was never intended to be employed that way.
Yeah. Oh. My goodness, Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my goodness. Oh.
Yeah, it is a huge, huge story, GeorgeAnn, and again, all of it is tied to this phenomenon of the grid.
Yes. Yes.
This is a huge puzzle.
Oh my, way. Yes. Yes,
yeah,
it is.
And an intricately constructed Chinese box.
Yeah.
That you won't be able to open unless you do certain things in a certain order. And that's why, sometimes I can't answer questions right away because you've got to till the ground and get things lined up so that when the answer comes, it makes sense.
Well, you certainly gave the listeners a lot of food for thought, and that's very appreciated, Joseph.
Well, thank you, GeorgeAnn.
Very appreciated. Oh.
Thank you. And
everybody go to GizaDeathStar.com. That's Joseph's personal website. And there is a PayPal button there, and please make use of it. We've got to keep him in research materials, and the things that he researches, for the most part, are not on the internet, so it does get expensive.
Thank you, GeorgeAnn.
And
help GeorgeAnn out too, folks. These shows are not easy or cheap to produce.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. What do you think about there was a plane crash, a Russian plane crash, and 44 people were killed, I think. And some of them were engineers that had worked on the nuclear plant, I think, in Iran.
Oh, my.
And I just think it's strange that a plane carrying these engineers would crash.
Well,
and in the latest article, they found no reason for the crash.
Well, GeorgeAnn, briefly, I think you are looking, if you look at some recent events, I think you're looking at these New World Order elites
yes.
shooting at each other.
Oh.
I've said over and over again that I think that you're looking at signs of cracks in the building.
Yes.
That they are now in the end. They think in the end game, and they all want to be the dominant elite.
Yeah.
And so they're shooting at each other.
Well,
they're showing the signs of panic.
Look at this horrible E. coli,
yes,
weaponized E. coli
in Germany. Yeah,
and there was something that they wanted Merkel to okay, and
she didn't. Yeah.
Yes, and then this outbreak came.
Well, not only that, but Chancellor Merkel's. I heard a story that her helicopter was also had some suspicious malfunction that nearly cost her life. But I think you're looking at these harebrained elites, starting to shoot at each other, and they're showing. I've said this for years now that they're showing signs of panic.
Yes, they are.
They're in a hurry for some reason.
Well, it has something to do with astrological alignments, I bet you.
Yes, it has to do with a lot of things, GeorgeAnn, and I think that's part of it. I think, I'll just say this. I think that there is a possibility.
Yes.
Underscore, underline, italicize, and boldface the word possibility. That they may be worried that the cousins are coming back.
Yes.
And they may be getting indicators that the cousins aren't too happy with them.
Yeah. Well, look how crappy they've treated the people.
Yes, well, I'm not saying that the cousins were, based on the ancient texts, were a terribly good group of people themselves.
Yes.
But, if you take those texts seriously and at face value, I think, they'd be a little upset.
Yeah.
So, they may be in a panic for reasons having nothing to do with what's going on this planet.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
That's a big story.
Well, that's like I said, it's a possibility underscore boldface and italicize.
Yes.
Possibility.
Oh, Joseph, it's always a joy to work with
you.
you, and thank you for being so gracious.
Well,
and just, I know the listeners look for your files, and I'm very happy